That's a gimmick. It's a parlor game meant to inflame partisan hostility and play on our divisions. So let me be crystal clear. President Trump was not impeached because the words he used, viewed in isolation, without context, were beyond the pale. Plenty of other politicians have used strong language. But Donald J. Trump was president of the United States. He sought to overturn a presidential election that had been upheld by every single court to consider it. He spent months insisting to his base that the only way he could lose was a dangerous, wide-ranging conspiracy against them and America itself. He relentlessly attempted to persuade his followers that the peaceful transfer of power that was taking place in the Capitol was an abomination that had to be stopped at all costs. He flirted with groups like the Proud Boys, telling them to stand back and stand by, while endorsing violence and sparking death threats to his opponents. He summoned an armed, angry, and dangerous crowd that wanted to keep him in power and was widely reported to be poised on a hair trigger for violence at his direction. He then made his heated statements in circumstances where it was clear, where it was foreseeable that those statements would spark extraordinary, imminent violence. He then failed to defend the Capitol, the Congress, and the Vice President during the insurrection, engaging in extraordinary dereliction of duty and desertion of duty that was only possible because of the high office he held. He issued statements during the insurrection targeting the Vice President and reiterating the very same lies about the election that had launched the violence in the first place. And he issued a tweet 5 hours after the Capitol was sacked, in which he sided with the bad guys. We all know that context matters, that office and meaning and intent and consequences matter. Simply put, it matters when and where and how we speak. The oaths we've sworn and the power we hold matter. President Trump was not impeached because he used words that the House decided are forbidden or unpopular. He was impeached for inciting armed violence against the government of the United States of America. This leads me to a few final thoughts about why it's so important for you to hear this case as authorized and as indeed required by our history and by the Constitution. President Trump's lawyers will say, I expect, that you should dismiss this case so that the country can move on. They'll assert that this impeachment is partisan and that the spirit of bipartisanship and bipartisan cooperation requires us to drop the case and march forward in unity. With all due respect, every premise and every conclusion of that argument is wrong. Just weeks ago, the President of the United States literally incited an armed attack on the Capitol, our seat of government, while seeking to retain power by subverting an election he lost, and then celebrated the attack. People died. People were brutally injured. President Trump's actions endangered every single member of Congress, his own vice president, thousands of congressional staffers, and our own Capitol Police and other law enforcement. This was a national tragedy, a disaster for America's standing in the world. And President Trump is singularly responsible for inciting it. As we will prove, the attack on the Capitol was not solely the work of extremists lurking in the shadows. Indeed, does anyone in this chamber honestly believe that but for the conduct of President Trump, that a charge in the article of impeachment, that attack at the Capitol would have occurred? Does anybody believe that? And now his lawyers will come before you and insist, even as the Capitol is still surrounded with barbed wires and fences and soldiers, that we should just move on. Let bygones be bygones, and allow President Trump to walk away without any accountability, any reckoning, any consequences. That cannot be right. That is not unity. That's the path to fear of what future presidents could do. So there's a good reason why this article of impeachment passed the House with bipartisan support. The principles at stake belong to all Americans from all walks of life. We have a common interest in making clear that there are lines nobody can cross, especially the President of the United States. And so we share an interest in this trial where the truth can be shown and where President Trump can be called to account for his offenses. William Faulkner famously wrote that the past is never dead. But this isn't even the past. This just happened. It's still happening. Look around you as you come to the Capitol and come to work. I really do not believe that our attention span is so short, that our sense of duty so frail, our factional loyalty so all-consuming, that the president can provoke an attack on Congress itself and get away with it just because it occurred near the end of his term. After a betrayal like this, there cannot be unity without accountability. And this is exactly what the Constitution calls for. The framers' original understanding, this chamber's own precedent, and the very words used in the Constitution all confirm unquestionably, indisputably, that President Trump must stand trial for his high crimes and misdemeanors against the American people. We must not, we cannot continue down the path of partisanship and division that has turned the Capitol into an armed fortress. Senators, it now falls to you to bring our country together by holding this trial, and once all the evidence is before you, by delivering justice. Thank you.
Senators, Mr. President, to close, I want to say something personal about the stakes of this decision, whether President Trump can stand trial and be held to account for inciting insurrection against us. This trial is personal indeed for every senator, for every member of the House, every manager, all of our staff, the Capitol Police, the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, the National Guard, maintenance and custodial crews, the print journalists and TV people who were here, and all of our families and friends. And I hope this trial reminds America how personal democracy is, and how personal is the loss of democracy, too. Distinguished members of the Senate, my youngest daughter, Tabitha, was there with me on Wednesday, January 6th. It was the day after we buried her brother, our son Tommy, the saddest day of our lives. Also, there was my son-in-law, Hank, who's married to our oldest daughter, Hannah, and I consider him a son too, even though he eloped with my daughter and didn't tell us what they were going to do. But it was in the middle of COVID-19. But the reason they came with me that Wednesday, January 6th, was because they wanted to be together with me in the middle of a devastating week for our family. And I told them I had to go back to work because we were counting electoral votes that day on January 6th. It was our constitutional duty. And I invited them instead to come with me to witness this historic event, the peaceful transfer of power in America. And they said they heard that President Trump was calling on his followers to come to Washington to protest, and they asked me directly, would it be safe? Would it be safe? And I told them, of course it should be safe. This is the Capitol. Steny Hoyer, our majority leader, had kindly offered me the use of his office on the House floor because I was one of the managers that day and we were going through our grief. So Tabitha and Hank were with me in Steny's office as colleagues dropped by to console us about the loss of our middle child, Tommy, our beloved Tommy. Mr. Neguse and Mr. Cicilline actually came to see me that day. Dozens of members, lots of Republicans, lots of Democrats came to see me. And I felt a sense of being lifted up from the agony. And I won't forget their tenderness. And through the tears, I was working on a speech for the floor when we would all be together in joint session. And I wanted to focus on unity when we met in the House. I quoted Abraham Lincoln's famous 1838 Lyceum speech, where he said that if division and destruction ever come to America, it won't come from abroad. It'll come from within, said Lincoln. And in that same speech, Lincoln passionately deplored mob violence. This was right after the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist newspaper editor. And Lincoln deplored mob violence, and he deplored mob rule. And he said it would lead to tyranny and despotism in America. That was the speech I gave that day after the House very graciously and warmly welcomed me back. And Tabitha and Hank came with me to the floor, and they watched it from the gallery. And when it was over, they went back to that office, Steny's office, off of the House floor. They didn't know that the House had been breached yet, and that an insurrection, a riot, or a coup had come to Congress. And by the time we learned about it, about what was going on, it was too late. I couldn't get out there to be with them in that office. And all around me, people were calling their wives and their husbands, their loved ones, to say goodbye. Members of Congress, in the House anyway, were removing their congressional pins so they wouldn't be identified by the mob as they tried to escape the violence. Our new chaplain got up and said a prayer for us, and we were told to put our gas masks on. And then there was a sound I will never forget, the sound of pounding on the door like a battering ram. The most haunting sound I ever heard, and I will never forget it. My chief of staff, Julie Tagan, was with Tabitha and Hank, locked and barricaded in that office. The kids hiding under the desk, placing what they thought were their final texts and whispered phone calls to say their goodbyes. They thought they were going to die. My son-in-law had never even been to the Capitol before. And when they were finally rescued, over an hour later by Capitol officers, and we were together, I hugged them and I apologized, and I told my daughter Tabitha, who's 24 and a brilliant algebra teacher in Teach for America. Now, I told her how sorry I was, and I promised her that it would not be like this again the next time she came back to the Capitol with me. And you know what she said? She said, "Dad, I don't want to come back to the Capitol again." Of all the terrible, brutal things I saw and I heard on that day, and since then, that one hit me the hardest. That and watching someone use an American flagpole with the flag still on it to spear and pummel one of our police officers ruthlessly, mercilessly, tortured by a pole with a flag on it that he was defending. with his very life. People died that day. Officers ended up with head damage and brain damage. People's eyes were gouged. An officer had a heart attack. An officer lost 3 fingers that day. 2 officers have taken their own lives. Senators, this cannot be our future. This cannot be the future of America. We cannot have presidents inciting and mobilizing mob violence against our government and our institutions because they refuse to accept the will of the people under the Constitution of the United States. Much less can we create a new January exception in our precious, beloved Constitution that prior generations have died for and fought for, so that corrupt presidents have several weeks to get away with whatever it is they want to do. History does not support a January exception in any way, so why would we invent one for the future? We close, Mr. President, and reserve your time.
I ask unanimous consent. I ask unanimous consent. There now be a 10-minute break. I ask unanimous consent the Senate recess for 10 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Senators and House managers will be filing out after that emotional presentation by Congressman Raskin, Democrat of the state of Maryland, Nicolle Wallace. To remind our viewers, this is just the beginning. This is to prove the constitutionality of what they are doing here today. And of course, along the way is the event that took most of the attention today, and that was a 13-minute or thereabout video review of the horrors of that day on the Capitol.
I've been baking my way through the pandemic, as has Claire McCaskill, so I'll use a cake analogy here. I thought that what the Democrats presented was a 3-layer cake. The foundation that appears to be squarely on their side was a legal case about the constitutionality, and they made it with the words of some of the most revered and respected conservative legal all-stars. They used Chuck Cooper. They used judges appointed by former President Bush. They used Jonathan Turley, who was an impeachment manager on the Trump side in the first impeachment. I thought the next layer was that video. I thought that was the heart of their case, the horror. It was like watching a documentary about Benghazi or Mumbai or any deadly attack premeditated and plotted and incited in full view and carried out without remorse, without shame, and with clearly evil intent. And then I thought the top layer was the gut punch, was Congressman Raskin's story of where he was and why. He was in Steny Hoyer's office because he just lost his son, and he brought his family there because they were grieving together. And I thought one of the most powerful things he said was that he was being lifted up by Democrats and Republicans, and he planned to give a speech that day, the day of the insurrection, about unity. And we all know what happened next. And I don't know on what grounds Republicans think that they can look away. But I don't think anyone watching, I don't think anyone in the country looked away.
Claire McCaskill, that'll be something to watch. How do you?
Well, first of all, if anybody has not seen this video, find it online and share it with people, especially